Cuba loudly supports LGBTQ+ with more than 700 same-sex marriages. More than 700 same-sex marriages have been celebrated in Cuba since the family code was approved in a referendum last year. The figure was confirmed last week by the National Center for Sex Education at the opening of the Cuban Days against Homophobia and Transphobia, which will take place on the island until May 20th. In total, in the 6 months since the approval of the code and the end of March, 745 marriages were performed, 462 of them between men and 283 between women, while 35 effective de facto unions between people of the same sex were also formalized. This and other advances of the LGBTQ+ community in Cuba that is covered by the new legislation will be celebrated during the 16th edition of these days, taking place under the motto, "For all families, love is law." The entry into force of what the family code has enforced was endorsed at the polls with 66.85% of the votes. The Cuban Days against Homophobia and Transphobia began to be officially held in Cuba in 2008. It's organized by CINESEX. They are celebrated around May 17th, a day established by the United Nations as International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. So this is a complicated story for a number of reasons, I think, because talking about authoritarianism, right? So we got to unpack a lot here. And I always want to give, I want to talk about this in layers in some ways, right? That is, La Jornada contra la Homofobia is an important step forward since the 2008, and there's been, and CINESEX even long before that, decades long before that. That is, in many ways, right, Cuba had understood that in order to move forward with like things like, I mean, historically, Cuba after 1959 and before that too, but certainly after 1959 hardened its homophobic policies, just in general, right? Like it was a homophobic state, right? It for a number of different ways. It had a lot of work to do to repair some of that work and counter that. It's moved in some steps in this way, but it still remains so largely operated by the state-controlled movement of what LGBTQ+ looks like. The idea that this was in a referendum is a really big step forward. And we're seeing, I mean, people have kind of questioned what that looks like and what that means, and we could talk about it as a group. But it would be really great to also imagine other forms of LGBTQ+ liberation in Cuba that aren't operating under the state, that aren't operating under state control. And this is one of those really complicated topics that you have to kind of almost peel as, I mean, like anything else really, but I don't want to, but also those numbers are really encouraging, right? That is, I don't want to diminish also what that might mean for someone who's LGBTQ+, right, in Cuba.
I'm curious, Julio, you're representing, de facto, representing the Spanish-speaking community in LGBT here in South Florida. Do you think most Spanish-speaking LGBT would celebrate this news, or it's just rejected because we reject Cuba?
I'm not sure. I think the Latino community looks a lot of different ways, just like the LGBTQ+ community looks a lot of different ways. I think that there's a lot here to look at from a really encouraging point of view, and a lot of things here to be really mindful and critical of, right? Like that is, I think we have to be really mindful of also what statistics look like when it's produced by the state government. I think we have to be mindful of how they're produced, how they're couched, how they're kind of promoted. Going back to our conversation in our last segment about empire, so much of Cuba's relationship to LGBTQ progress and advancement has often been vis-a-vis the United States, right? That is like, they started talking about same-sex marriage just when George W. Bush said, let's pass a constitutional amendment to ban it, right? Like, let's look more democratic than the United States. So much of the relationship between LGBTQ+ reality has been vis-a-vis the United States, and not alone, right? Also what that looks like in Russia, what that looks like in Spain, what that looks like in Argentina. So like it's hard to kind of just put this in a context of like some national.
Is it possible for LGBT South Florida to take the victory regardless of how they got there?
I think all things are possible.
Yeah. When you compare Cuba's positioning of the by all intensive ways. We reported on this vote on the island extensively. You can compare and contrast them to what Mississippi and Arkansas would like to do. And arguably, in the area of LGBT rights, Cuba is more populist than Mississippi or Arkansas. Then in the Caribbean, when you compare and contrast it to Jamaica or Grand Cayman, for example, or other Caribbean islands, the colonialism that caused so much homophobia in the Caribbean was based on the expansion of colonialism from the United Kingdom. They seem to be, at least on this subject, doing better than many of their peers.
I mean, it depends on what better means, right? And there's still a lot of what that means. So is marriage better? For whom? For you?
Well.
But you don't speak for everyone.
Okay.
I mean, but that is like, for some people, marriage may not be better. For some single families, that may not be the kind of original, like that is, it would depend, right? Like that is, I don't want to speak for anyone or for everyone, but that is that people do have nuanced experiences and nuanced realities. And but I do want to follow the thread that you said, and I feel like I just attacked you. I don't mean to attack you, Al. You look like you just cowered. I didn't mean to. But that is like, it's a complicated topic, and I don't want to simplify it by saying like, is marriage better? I'm not sure that if we polled everybody, some people would be like, marriage may not have been what they wanted to see as part of the LGBT
Here's
movement.
one interesting thing. I don't think we're capable of landing any plane in this conversation. But one of the things that I think is interesting is we're reporting on the fact that Cuba historically allows a referendum, an election of their citizens to vote. And unless we claim that the vote was fraudulent, the conclusion is that people in Cuba got to vote. And in a very significant percentage, marriage and family equality was granted by the citizens of Cuba. We report that 700 and some couples have married since last year's notion of doing the Family Embracement Act in Cuba. And contrast that to so many of the conversations that we've had at Queer News Tonight of where are our gay, white, privileged men. It began and ended almost. I've heard this conversation 100 times at Queer News Tonight on gay marriage. It was the central piece of why we think much of the gay community is not responding in the activism degrees that we think, because we got the right we wanted, which was gay marriage.
And hence complacency.
And so in this instance, that's what Cuba got. And all I'm trying to suggest is, I can't tell if marriage is important to us or not important to us. But whatever the contrast is going on in Cuba, I see significant progress in Cuba, at least as it applies to LGBT rights. And then I see significant apathy in America, in Miami Beach and Miami-Dade County, and what is going on in Florida. And a lot of the apathy is in our own community.
Obviously, I don't know the rhetoric that's happening inside of Cuba and from the government perspective, but I think we become very complacent here because we think that we are the bastion of freedom. And when we hear that somebody else has, again, what Cuba could also be doing is saying we're acknowledging a legal contract of marriage, right, between whoever it is, and we're not going to get involved in your bedroom. In the United States, we've said, oh, everyone can get married, except we're going to call you a pedophile. We're going to call you a pedophile, and we're going to call you someone who's trying to turn everybody into transgender people. So we have so much freedom here, but then we have the tyranny of bigotry that comes across with that freedom. So it is very nuanced, and we take on that badge of like, well, we're the country of freedom, but we're actually not in so many ways.
If I can, that's well said. There was the day after, I think it was the day after, or shortly after the 2015 decision in the Supreme Court in Obergefell, right? There was a cartoon, I want to say it was in the Jamaica Observer. It was a Jamaican newspaper of this kind of like, it was like someone kind of like creating like a house or something to protect Jamaica from the storm that was going to be same-sex marriage, that was going to essentially enforce itself onto the Caribbean and parts. And it's a really powerful image, because that is, while some people might view marriage as a form of liberation, for others it's imperialism. For others, it's a form of colonialism. Like, you know what's best, so let's make sure that we bring the savior complex of what what liberation might look like for you. And I'm not saying that that's what you agree with or anyone agrees with, right? But that is, in this way, the referendum is a form of people voicing their wants, right, their needs, and this is really important. We listen to them and we let the people decide what it is that liberation for LGBTQ people in Cuba looks like, right? I imagine it looks like liberation in against authoritarianism, right? Like that there's other forms that might be more significant than marriage for people on a day-to-day basis. So I just want us to think to say that something's progress for LGBTQ when situations are dire is to miss the story.
I'd also like to point out another storyline that doesn't really make itself easily apparent, but it's very important, and that's allyship. I mean, it's Castro's daughter, Mariela. She's been an advocate for us on the island for decades. And this marriage in Cuba would not have happened this soon. I know things happen over time, but this soon without her support. And so to have allyship in America is important too. We need to cultivate our relationships as well.
We continue to watch what's going on in Cuba, and one of the standards we are not going to be able to fight out any battle over an embargo that's gone on since 1962, and it is a fact. So our lens is focusing on LGBT rights on the island, which is what we're reporting on. One of the things that I do think is interesting in terms of what we're watching in Cuba is they may have passed through the Family Act and reported in this show in terms of what they're doing of embracing fights against transphobia and fights against homophobia and the embracement of LGBT and however that looks marriage. And none of those things may be flowing out of the governor's mansion in Florida. So when we hate on Cuba, we have to put it in context of what we watch from our own authoritarian decision makers here in Florida.
LGBTQ plus news is vital for our community and for the broader world as a whole. We have enough enemies at Fox News. Tucker, Sean, and Laura are loud. We need passionate allies. Happening Out Television Network, Queer News Tonight, and It's Happening Out are literally out of the closet and into the headlines. Our community needs your support. Like this broadcast and subscribe now to ensure the growth of the entire LGBTQ plus community.